Well, good morning, and welcome to this Conservation Applied Research and Development, or CARD webinar. I'm Mary Sue Lobenstein, and I'm the R&D Program Administrator at the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Division of Energy Resources. And in today's webinar, we're going to review results from a white paper project which investigated electrification as it relates to Minnesota, and more specifically within the Utility Conservation Improvement Program, or CIP. With me today is Anthony Fryer, who is the CIP coordinator at the Division of Energy Resources. Anthony will provide some context for this topic, as well as review the department's plans for future engagement. Our main presenter today is Carl Samuelson, who is the manager for client solutions at Michaels Energy. At Michaels, Carl works to bridge the technical and human elements of energy efficiency. Carl has been a project manager on a number of past CARD projects and led the research that's behind the white paper that is being presented today. Before we start, I just want to go over a few webinar basics. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. As questions occur to you during the presentation, type them into the Q&A box on the WebEx panel and send them to all panelists. To display the Q&A box, click the question mark icon in the upper right corner of the WebEx dashboard. Now, we'll do our best to answer all questions within the time allotted, but if for some reason we don't get all questions answered within that time, we will answer them later and email all participants a copy of the Q&A from the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to it will be available on both the department's and Michael's website at a later date. The slide set from this webinar will also be available. This webinar is one in an ongoing series designed to summarize the results from research projects that have been funded by Minnesota's Applied Research and Development Fund, which was established by the Next Generation Energy Act of 2007. The purpose of that fund is to help Minnesota utilities achieve their 1.5% energy saving goal. About $2.6 million annually is set aside for the CARD program, which awards research grants in a competitive research request for proposal process. Results from CARD projects provide utilities with information to enhance energy efficiency programs within their CIP portfolios. As you can see by this pie chart, projects funded to date have been in all building sectors. The subject of today's webinar is multi-sector and will present an introduction to electrification in Minnesota in order to provide baseline information and resources on the topic. Now I'm going to turn it over to Anthony, who will get us started.
Thanks, Mary Sue. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Mary Sue mentioned, just before we hand over to Carl for the main body of the presentation, I just wanted to provide some context for the white paper and the conversation around electrification in Minnesota. Currently, we do have a fuel switching prohibition within the Conservation Improvement Program that's been in place since 2005 by order of the Department of Commerce. And the purpose of that policy, broadly speaking, was to avoid the use of CIP dollars as a sort of load building exercise and rather to keep efficiency efforts within specific fuel types. A narrow exception to that prohibition was issued by the department in 2012 for low-income electric customers. But it is important to note that both the 2005 order and the 2012 guidance were both issued before the conversation or even the concept of beneficial electrification was on sort of anybody's mind in Minnesota. And given the growing discussion around electrification in Minnesota over the last, I'd say 2 or 3 years, the department has, over the past few months, decided to take or lead 3 different initiatives to help advance the conversation with regards to electrification in Minnesota. we can go to the next slide. So earlier this year, we commissioned Michaels Energy to do a white paper on electrification in the state, and really to provide a Minnesota-centric analysis for electrification and for fuel switching, and hopefully to act as an effective primer for CIP stakeholders that are interested in this subject, and that'll be the findings of that white paper will be the topic for today's webinar. The department will also be leading a fuel switching stakeholder process in 2019 to revisit the 2005 fuel switching prohibition in light of recent conversations both around electrification but also beneficial fuel switching in general, and make a determination with CIP stakeholders as to whether a change in policy is necessary, and if so, what that change should look like. We issued an RFP earlier this fall for a group to come in and help us facilitate that process, and once we've selected that grantee, we'll be reaching out to CIP stakeholders in the new year to provide more details about that. And then our third initiative is a US DOE funded electrification action plan, and this is something that we received word of this fall, and we'll be working with DOE over the next few weeks to finalize the contract. But this will be working with 6 CIP stakeholders over the next 2 or so years to address electrification topics specifically, those involving regulation and policy, various electrification technologies, metrics, and then grid modernization impacts and any benefits that might result. And Michaels Energy and Environmental Initiative will be working with the department on that particular action plan development. And so with that sort of context in mind, I'll now hand it over to Carl to go through the findings of the white paper.
Thank you, Anthony. And thank you all for attending the webinar today. I would like to start by thanking the Department of Commerce for their leadership, engaging stakeholders, and exploring what this topic means in Minnesota. And then I'd also like to thank the staff from the 24 different organizations that participated in this research. I am always grateful to work in such a collaborative industry in Minnesota. By way of brief introduction, Michaels Energy is an engineering and energy efficiency consulting firm headquartered in La Crosse, Wisconsin, with offices in a number of other Midwestern cities, including Minneapolis. Locally in Minnesota and Iowa, we partner with utilities to implement programs for commercial and industrial customers. In the context of this presentation, I want to mention that research and evaluation is also a core part of our company. In the past 10 years, we've conducted 8 CARD-funded studies for the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and we also have conducted dozens of program evaluations for utilities, regulators, and program administrators across the country. This webinar today is an oral visual version of a white paper that will soon be published by the Department of Commerce. Please look to that white paper when it gets published for more information. I was not able to fit everything into the presentation today, and so in the paper you can look to find more background on Minnesota policy, specific reviews of recently published research, a wealth of information about different technologies, and a lot more feedback from stakeholders, including some direct quotes that I'm not sharing today. This project had 3 goals. The work focuses on Minnesota policies, stakeholders, program dynamics, and our state's fuel mix, and even our weather, in order to pare down the focus of a very wide topic and add something unique to what is becoming a sea of research on electrification. And as a contribution to that abundance of research and writing, I hope this presentation and white paper serve to raise the baseline level of knowledge on the topic here in Minnesota, so that more people can feel competent and able to participate in future dialogue. And finally, one of the goals was to frame up key questions for stakeholders to engage with in the future. And there's a number of places where that gets highlighted today. Let's begin with some background on Minnesota policies and review the key concepts. In 2007, Minnesota enacted the Next Generation Energy Act. This landmark legislation established a goal for the state of Minnesota of an 80% reduction of greenhouse gases from 2005 levels by 2050. It also expanded the state's energy efficiency programs into the form we know them in today. On this slide, you can see that the data from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that shows that Minnesota is in fact not doing that well in meeting the goal on a sector-by-sector basis. This chart shows data through December 2014. As an aside, data geeks can rejoice because new data will be released on January 2019 up through 2016 emission data. So in this data, the utility sector is the only sector on track to meet the interim goal of a 15% reduction by 2015. Transportation and agriculture have declined some, but emissions from industrial, residential, commercial, and waste sectors increased during this period. The fact that Minnesota is not meeting its goal in every sector has led many to the conclusion that capitalizing on the electric sector's decarbonization will be key to reducing emissions from other sectors in the economy. This leads us to the concept of beneficial electrification, and the idea that using this decarbonized electricity to replace traditionally fossil-fueled end uses like transportation and space heating could achieve a net reduction in carbon emissions. This idea of achieving a societal benefit sets this type of electrification apart from good old-fashioned load building. Some kind of standard or test is required to define when an instance of electrification is beneficial. While many people are working on this topic, I'm referencing work done by the Regulatory Assistance Project on this slide. In their definition, they suggest that electrification is beneficial when it can achieve one of three litmus tests without negatively impacting the other two. Those tests include, first, that the project saves customers money over the long run. Second, that it reduces environmental impacts, specifically reducing carbon emissions. And third, that it enables better grid management, such as offering the ability to schedule or control a new electric load so that it doesn't exacerbate the grid's peak. I think it's helpful to step back and reflect on why today we can talk about beneficial electrification. Historically, as in only 10 or 15 years ago, beneficial fuel switching would have been a proposal to switch from electric heat to high-efficiency natural gas appliances because of their low fuel cost and high efficiency when the whole life cycle of fuel consumption starting at the power plant was taken into account. But today the conversation has shifted, and that is because of three enabling trends in the industry, again as identified by the Regulatory Assistance Project. First, electric technology has gotten more efficient. Cars with electric motors and batteries provide a viable alternative to industrial and internal combustion vehicles. Heat pump performance and efficiency has improved so that there are realistic heating options even in cold climates. Second, there is a lot more renewable energy on the grid. Particularly in Minnesota, wind generation makes a sizable share of our energy mix. The state's largest utility, Xcel Energy, announced yesterday that they will be 100% carbon-free by 2050 with an interim goal, target of 80% by 2030. Finally, the third trend is that we have much better abilities to control equipment into running at certain times of day. Instead of a pneumatic valve turning something on and off, we have cheap digital controls with internet connectivity that make it easy to ask a piece of equipment in a home or business to run when low cost and renewable energy is available. That brings us to our state's policy context. As Anthony mentioned, electrification is, by definition, fuel switching, and fuel switching is prohibited within the conservation improvement programs. As one stakeholder commented, Minnesota's statutes are fairly silent on the topic of fuel switching and electrification, and that means that guidance on this topic has come from regulatory interpretation. The primary piece of interpretation is a 2005 Department of Commerce order prohibiting fuel switching. It was issued after a multi-year effort engaging stakeholders and researching and reviewing comments on the topic. Unlike today, its origin came from a gas company proposal to incentivize high-efficiency gas water heaters in new construction. Evidently, an inadvertent code change had affected the new construction market, and Minigasco proposed to adjust this with a CIP incentive rooted in a total B2 analysis, which showed natural gas was more efficient when the fuel inputs to electricity production were included. In documentation around that 2005 order, the department staff noted that an exception for allowing fuel switching programs for low-income customers might be warranted. And then in 2012, the department issued that guidance, which allows low-income programs to claim energy savings from fuel switching as long as the customer was using propane, fuel oil, both of which are kind of called delivered fuels, or a CIP-exempt natural gas provider. Small natural gas providers in Minnesota are exempt from participation in CIP. And then finally, we arrive at Otter Tail Power's program modification request in 2017, in which Otter Tail was proposing to essentially extend the low-income exception to customers of any income in order to promote heat pumps as an efficient heating option. This topic has been of great interest across the industry in 2017 and 2018. On the screen is a partial list of organizations that came out with publications, research studies, conferences, or white papers on the topic of electrification in the first half of 2018. In the white paper, a number of these studies are discussed in some detail, and I would commend many of them to you. There's a lot of great research on this topic right now. You could start with our white paper and then look to the 3 to 4 page works cited section of the paper as a good reading list. While I'm not going to take the time in this presentation to review all of that literature, I did want to share a bit of info by way of illustrating trends that emerged across studies I reviewed. In this case, I'm sharing information from the Electric Power Research Institute's Efficient Electrification Report issued in 2018, which I commend to you. But since this data is from the Electric Power Research Institute, an organization devoted to researching and promoting electric technology, I want to point out the data from NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and the Rocky Mountain Institute found similar trends within their modeling scenarios. I'm using the EPRI data because it's well presented, and I like their modeling approach of building up their scenarios based on measured cost effectiveness and the current pace of technology adoption. But as I've said, there are a number of excellent studies. In this chart, you see the 4 scenarios EPRI modeled. Their reference scenario, the gray one, the second one down, is a business as usual scenario that assumes that current technology advances and adoption trends continue, in some cases rapidly based on current patterns. They back off those technology adoption assumptions to create their more conservative scenario, the blue one on top. In the progressive and transformation scenarios, adoption is augmented by a public policy that puts a price on carbon. That might be a carbon tax, for instance. In the progressive scenario, they model the effect of a $15 per ton price of carbon, and their transformational scenario uses a $50 per ton price of carbon. As you can see, in every scenario, and these trends were true in other modeling efforts as well, final energy consumption dropped by 2050. Final energy is the amount of energy consumed in the building or at the end-use equipment itself. This is largely due to energy efficiency gains in buildings, equipment, and vehicles. Of that final energy, electricity consumption comprises an increased share of all energy consumed in the economy across all of their modeling scenarios. And then interestingly, in EPRI's model, natural gas consumption also increases in every scenario. This is largely due to the expanded role that natural gas plays in electric generation as electricity consumption increases. But natural gas continues to play a role as a primary home heating fuel and as a backup to air source heat pumps. And then natural gas also continues to be used in industrial applications. Finally, economy-wide, EPRI's models resulted in a drop in carbon emissions. I think it's interesting that unlike other models that set an 80% reduction target as the goal and then develop strategies that could reach that goal at low cost, EPRI's model builds up the end uses based on an economic decision-making model. And that means that in their transformational scenario, a $50 per ton price of carbon is enough to drive down the economy-wide carbon emissions by nearly 70% by 2050. One of the goals of this research was to look around and collect efforts from other states to inform policy directions for Minnesota. These efforts can be broken into states that are addressing fuel switching within their conservation programs and states that are promoting electrification for meeting carbon reduction goals. Here are 3 examples of states that have approached fuel switching within their conservation programs. First, Illinois provides a good example for Minnesota because their statutes are pretty similar to our statutes. They have a little more openness in their definition of energy efficiency, and the legislature has made that distinction more explicit, that efficiency means savings of any fuel type. The rest of the implementation has come through regulatory interpretation, and as is, the state includes 3 fuel switching measures within their technical reference manual: heat pumps, both geothermal and air source, and combined heat and power. The technical reference manual specifies that savings can be shared between participating gas and electric utilities. For heat pumps, for instance, the gas utility gets credit for switching a customer to the baseline heat pump, and then the electric utility gets credit for incentivizing a customer to get to a high efficiency unit. In Maine, fuel switching measures get some funding support from the Regional Cap and Trade Program. The state, like many in the Northeast, is focused on opportunities to reduce fuel oil use in home heating. This incentive operates through the state's third-party efficiency program, Efficiency Maine. And then California has an approved protocol for allowing fuel switching measures called the 3-prong test. Measures are allowed when, first, the first prong, source BTU consumption does not increase. Second, cost-effectiveness tests are passed. And third, there aren't adverse effects to the environment. While this sounds like a straightforward formula, the California PUC recently agreed to review the tests because advocates in the state argued that the test is serving as a roadblock to implementation of fuel switching measures. Because stakeholders lack clarity around specifically how to pass the tests and how to meet the burden of proof required. On the electrification policy side, the Northeast is again a strong leader in policy development. Vermont created a path for compliance in its renewable energy standard for energy transformation projects, or projects that, quote, reduce customer fossil fuel consumption and save money. In Massachusetts this summer, new legislation was passed that added load management programs to the existing energy efficiency programs that utilities are expected to offer. Strategic electrification is specifically identified as an element of those load management plans. And since the legislation is relatively new, it remains to be seen exactly how this change will work its way into utility programs. New York's Reforming Our Energy Vision effort has been an industry leader on a number of fronts, and electrification is one of them via their renewable heating initiatives. There is quite a lot of activity there. Also of interest in New York, a few utilities have had earning adjustment mechanisms approved by the Public Service Commission to reward them for environmentally beneficial electrification. The paper goes on into a bit more detail on both of those and offers some references. And then finally, British Columbia is a Canadian province worth watching. They have passed legislation enabling the state-owned utility BC Hydro to promote electrification. BC Hydro is piloting some efforts right now, and then this is particularly interesting because natural gas is produced in British Columbia and is a very low-cost resource in that region. I apologize if there's some background noise. The cooling tower above me decided to turn on, I guess, in December. So some states are taking action without specific policy direction. And I've listed 2 examples, but I know there are more. Sacramento Municipal Utility District, SMUD, is providing large rebates to incentivize customers to convert to heat pumps in their homes, and that's both hot water, heat pumps for hot water and heat pumps for space heating. And then the Tennessee Valley Authority has converted all of their efficiency programs to electrification programs within the last year or 2. Okay, let's move on to technologies for a brief overview of some key technologies that could offer benefits if electrified. I refer you to our final white paper as an excellent primer on these various technologies. For each technology in the paper, we provide background information, some performance metrics, and additional resources. And while we conducted a careful analysis on each technology, this is an appetizer, not an entree. This report isn't intended to be the final word on the benefits of a given technology or to decisively pick winners or losers among the technology pool. More analysis will be needed. Specifically, I'd like to preempt some questions I expect might come by highlighting two aspects of the way we analyze these technologies. First, on source energy. We use the Department of Energy's captured energy methodology for calculating source energy consumption. For a fossil fuel burning power plant, source energy consumption expressed as a heat rate for the power plant includes all the energy in the fuel that was consumed in the process to make electricity. For renewable energy, the captured energy approach sets that heat rate factor at the conversion value of BTUs to kilowatt hours. While renewables are not 100% efficient at capturing the sun that shines on their panels or the wind that passes by their blades, this methodology accounts for the fact that the sun would shine and the wind would blow regardless of whether there was a panel or a turbine there to collect that energy. This means that as the grid gets more renewable, the overall source energy used for electricity will also decrease. My second caveat, emissions are tricky to calculate. The easy, straightforward approach that we took was to use the average emissions for the entire state. This makes the math easy, but does a poor job reflecting the variation in each utility's generation mix and the variation at the generation mix for different times of day and times of year. A more accurate approach would be to use a marginal emissions analysis. A marginal emissions analysis accounts for the incremental generation asset required to run because of an incremental new load added to the grid. The challenge is that to do this right, you really need to model both loads and generation on an hourly basis, and we didn't have the ability to do that in the scope of this paper. And one comment from stakeholders was that small utilities don't necessarily have the ability to do this either. Suffice it to say, this topic is of keen interest to stakeholders because how you calculate the emissions impact could make or break a measure given Minnesota's current generation mix. So let's start. We're going to talk through a few different technologies very briefly. I want to start with home heating with heat pumps. Heat pumps use a vapor compression system, just like an air conditioner or refrigerator, to transfer heat from a heat sink either into or out of a home in order to heat or cool the building. The heat sink can either be in the ground, a ground source or geothermal heat pump, in water, a water source heat pump, or the ambient air source heat pump. Inside the home, the hot or cold air can either be distributed through ductwork, like a forced air furnace, or can be directly distributed into the rooms with a header unit mounted on the wall. This is often called a mini split or ductless heat pump. Recent technology advances have allowed specialty cold climate air source heat pumps to provide heat down to an ambient outdoor air temperature of -15 degrees. After that point, an air source heat pump would require a backup heating source, either an electric resistance furnace or a natural gas or propane furnace. Geothermal systems, since their heat sink is under the ground where temperature is more constant, do not require a backup heat source. Most of all, if this technology interests you, go read the Center for Energy and Environment's Cold Climate Air Source Heat Pump Field Assessment Study that was CARD funded. It's a great resource. In this chart, we've shown a few of our numbers from our analysis of heat pumps. I'm not going to walk through each of these, nor will I be showing this level of detail for every technology. The point I want to make here is that nuance matters in the conversation about which technologies can deliver the most benefits for Minnesota. As you'll see here, one technology stands out as having the lowest heating costs, the lowest source energy consumption, and the lowest carbon emissions, and that is the geothermal heat pump. They also have the highest first cost at 2 to 3 times more expensive than some of their competitor technologies. Likewise, Because propane is more expensive and slightly more carbon intensive than natural gas, there is an opportunity there too. For a Minnesotan who has a propane furnace, especially an inefficient unit, they could reduce their annual costs and carbon emissions by replacing their propane furnace with an air source heat pump with either a propane or natural gas furnace as a backup heat source. Let's talk briefly about heat pump water heaters. They also use that vapor compression system to extract heat from the air, and this time they transfer it into water. They are very efficient pieces of equipment from a site energy perspective, converting more than 200% of the energy they consume into heat and water. Heat pump water heaters are a well-developed technology and an especially excellent option for replacing an existing electric resistance water heater. However, in our analysis, heat pump water heaters on the average Minnesota grid were not cheaper, more efficient, or lower emitting than natural gas or propane water heaters. Of course, the cost and carbon components of the analysis would change if heat pump water heaters were controlled to charge only when renewable and low-cost energy was available. Electric lift trucks are the poster child of electrification, so I'm not going to spend much time on them. They continue to be a great example of a technology that can reduce emissions and operating costs through electrification, regardless of the grid mix. Especially for indoor applications, they improve indoor air quality and occupant health. The consensus seems to be that there's a slight premium in the first cost of electric lift trucks, but some of the data on costs is getting a little bit long in the tooth. It might be that with battery prices declining, so too has the cost gap between propane or diesel and electric forklifts. Refrigerated trucks use diesel-powered cooling units to keep goods cold during transport. There are now products that provide either a hybrid diesel-powered unit, which can be plugged in while parked, or an electric-first unit that runs only on electricity, and while the truck is driving, a diesel-powered generator delivers that electricity. In either case, there's significant cost savings to running the refrigeration unit off of electricity. The electric units reduce emissions, both carbon dioxide but also particulate emissions from burning diesel while parked. Electric units cost maybe 10% more than the standard units to purchase. One consideration from the infrastructure perspective is that trucks require shore power when docked for loading and parked at night. So in some cases, truck stops and rest stations might need access to electricity. Industrial electrification. There are a wide variety of industrial applications, especially for process heat. However, the key with industrial applications is that no one solution will work for every plant. In fact, the motivation to switch to an electric application might be motivated by benefits beyond cost or carbon savings. Key benefits an industrial facility might realize through electrification include reduced production time, reduced waste, better control or precision, and more responsive or localized heating and faster drying times. Finally, electric vehicles. Every stakeholder was watching the growth of electric vehicles, which has been rapid. According to a Frontier Group report, EV sales have increased more than 30% every year since 2015. We see many major car manufacturers planning new models, and costs continue to decline, led by declines in battery costs. With our current grid, electric vehicles reduce carbon emissions, but customer barriers like range anxiety, higher first cost, and charging infrastructure are still issues that the industry is working to address. Okay, we're going to move into the final part of the webinar and review results from the stakeholder interviews. There were 28 unique interview participants representing 24 different organizations. Participant organizations included a wide variety of local utilities, NGOs, government, trade associations, and researchers. Some participants represented a national constituency or were national electrification experts. Of the utilities interviewed, both gas, combination, and electric utilities participated, and they represented different business models, investor-owned, municipal, and cooperative. It is worth noting that this isn't a statistically representative sample, so in the stakeholder responses, we've done our best to represent all perspectives, but numerical results should be taken with this caveat in mind. This is not a comprehensive list of all stakeholders. In fact, 32 organizations were invited to participate, and future engagement efforts will continue to expand the number of people involved. The interview questions had two goals. First, the questions sought to gather information about electrification and fuel switching from the interviewees, as they have various expertises, specifically about technology, different policies, and other stakeholders to include in the process. And then the second goal was to gather from the stakeholders input and ideas on how to approach this topic from both a policy and a process perspective. One conclusion from working on this, the areas of consensus on this topic are greater than the areas of disagreement. The cleavages between stakeholders were generally cross-cutting and not reinforcing, meaning that, for instance, not all electric utilities held the same opinions, and not all environmental organizations, had different opinions. Generally, stakeholders represented a lot of nuance in their answers, which indicated open-mindedness to other positions on the topic. Let's start by discussing some areas of consensus that emerged. First, it might go without saying, but there was consensus across all participants that electrification could result in carbon emissions reductions. This was especially agreed upon for the transportation sector. For some other sectors, like home heating, stakeholders recommended looking at a case-by-case basis because, as I just showed in our technical analysis, nuance matters. Some stakeholders did point out that as the electric grid continues to decarbonize, so too will the end uses that consume electricity. So they recommended that carbon reduction analyses be extended over the life of the equipment, not just consider the first year it's installed. Getting the policy right was a common concern among stakeholders. Here, one person expressed it like this: one of my big worries through a lot of this process is that people are taking a paint roller to what really needs to be a pretty fine-brushed sort of picture. 24 out of 28 respondents said that the topic was important or very important to regulators to consider. People shared that this topic is trendy and electric utilities are pushing for it, and therefore regulators need to know their positions. And the few that didn't express that same level of priority shared that if regulators were pushing for carbon reductions, then it was probably important, but that consumers themselves aren't really pushing for electrification in a way that necessitates regulatory intervention. Stakeholders identified some key pieces in a decision-making process that would help all participants feel like their voice was heard and that they could accept the outcomes. Those were transparency, clearly defined objectives for the process, a clear understanding of costs, and a stakeholder inclusive process to determine the appropriate metrics. 19 out of 28 respondents were not concerned at all about changing the status quo prohibition on fuel switching. In fact, many of those 19 respondents strongly felt that the prohibition of fuel switching was a barrier to efficiency, carbon reductions, and restricted customer access to efficient technology. Some respondents were more cautious in their approach. They identified some of the past justifications for the prohibition and wanted to make sure that future actions maintained the commitment to cost effectiveness, customer protections, and real emissions reductions. Here's one stakeholder's comment: the reasons for those fuel switching provisions were put in. The reason that those fuel switching provisions were put in place still exists. Electrification can certainly be done for the benefit of the utility only, increasing sales. Stakeholders expressed that fuel switching needs to be fuel neutral. In fact, this was an interesting place to find consensus because I would have expected more distinction given that the current policy only applies to delivered fuels like propane and natural gas and CIP-exempt fuels. However, stakeholders broadly agreed that from a technical perspective, each fuel should be evaluated by the same methodology. A few stakeholders did suggest that there might be pragmatic reasons for starting with delivered and CIP-exempt fuels. Those reasons included, first, political expediency. Second, access to energy efficiency. If you start with customers who don't currently have access to CIP benefits, on the heating side, that delivers immediate impacts. And third, that you might want to avoid a situation where regulators need to consider their responsibility to protect the ratepayer of a regulated fuel. For instance, if customers switch away from natural gas, what responsibility do regulators have to control costs for the remaining natural gas customers? Here's a stakeholder quote on the topic, reinforcing that fuel switching needs to be fuel neutral. I think that we should be evaluating fuel switching on a list of criteria, not simply by fuel. Electric vehicle enthusiasm among stakeholders was pretty high. Every stakeholder mentioned it as a technology they were watching or expecting to make an impact. Electric utilities in particular are very engaged in thinking about the opportunity to meet customer demand and leverage this opportunity. While enthusiasm was high, a majority of stakeholders expressed doubt about how it would fit within the current framework of energy efficiency programs in the state. Stakeholders also expressed a need for more clarity from regulators about how electric utilities will be allowed to participate in shaping and supporting the market adoption of EVs. Let's move on to some areas of disagreement. When asked an open-ended question about the challenges facing electrification or fuel switching efforts, stakeholders responded with a wide variety of responses. The number one challenge identified was the prohibition of fuel switching, or on fuel switching. And then the second and third most common challenges identified centered less around policy and more around customer adoption. Either information barriers or cost barriers that customers were likely to face that would limit the adoption of the new electric technology. I heard from stakeholders that customers have to want to choose electric products in order for electrification to catch on. Desired outcomes for regulation came in two main groups: policy outcomes and consumer market outcomes. On the policy side, responses varied from those who wanted modest tweaks to CIP, to those who wanted major overhauls of the program, to those who wanted to make sure that the state maintained its commitment to energy efficiency throughout the process. On the consumer side, some stakeholders mentioned wanting to protect the consumer's interests in the process, to be sure that outcomes were cost-effective and affordable, and those who wanted to make sure utilities could be active in supporting this market expansion. One utility stakeholder expressed, "I hope we get to not a point where electrification is required, but allowed." Cost effectiveness was a persistent theme among those with more cautious voices. First and foremost, it was recognized by people that work will need to be done to figure out cost-benefit testing for electrification and fuel switching, both from a program design and from a project approval level. Voices representing businesses and consumers raised concerns about making sure energy costs stay low and that non-participating ratepayers get value out of electrification in the same ways they do from energy efficiency programs. In the category of truly no consensus was the question of whether electrification belongs within CIP. About a third of people suggested it did, saying that CIP was an effective model and it's the best thing that we have in the state to quickly accommodate our goals for electrification. About a third of the state said it should not be a part of CIP at all, that it would jeopardize efficiency programs, and if carbon reductions were important, they needed their own framework, perhaps modeled on CIP, but separate. And about a third of participants felt both ways. They could see a few specific measures being included in CIP, but also thought a separate program might be needed. And to that end, some stakeholders warned that given limited resources to apply to programs, utilities would probably prioritize the ones that grew their load if they were allowed to. This respondent says, "If electrification is simply lumped into CIP, I think there's a real risk of a zero-sum game adversely affecting energy efficiency." So I've reached the end of the stakeholder engagement, and the conversation will continue. I want to cover next just a few themes that were recognized as important topics for further engagement. First, there is work to be done with how these efforts relate to CIP. Obviously, there is some policy direction on the table, but also interesting questions remain around how electrification might impact CIP goals, especially since CIP goals are pegged to a % of sales, utility sales, and then also how utilities would be compensated. Utilities in Minnesota receive incentives for meeting their efficiency goals, in large part because there's not a natural business incentive for utilities to reduce sales. But that is not true for electrification, so that's an area of conversation. Secondly, secondly, and part of a much broader conversation is the goal of CIP. It was identified as something that we need to better understand as a community, specifically as we continue to grow into an understanding of the time and place specific value of energy and energy efficiency. Costs and benefits are a reoccurring theme of this presentation, and work needs to be done figuring out specifically the right methodology for accounting for them. But also in particular, carbon emissions calculations and figuring out the right mix of rigor and accessibility for quantifying emissions data will be important. Finally, equity is an important component, and there are kind of two broad ways to think about that, maybe, or many facets. What is the value and cost of electrification to non-participants? And then how do you create accessible programs? And how do we address price concerns for businesses and consumers? So we can continue this conversation because, as I say, this is the end of the presentation, but it is the beginning of quite a lot of work in Minnesota.
Great. Thank you, Carl. If you haven't already done so, please send us your questions via the Q&A box in your WebEx panel and send them to all panelists. Now I'm going to turn it over to Anthony again, who's been monitoring the questions that have come in. Anthony, do you have any questions that have come in for you or for Carl?
Yes, we've had one question come in so far, and as Mary Sue said, if you do have any questions, please submit them now, and we'll try and get them responded to before the end of the hour. Carl, the first question that we have is from Keith Thurman. On the heat pump table, he asks, why is there a 5 kW peak indicated when the backup is natural gas?
It's a good question. I think I would refer him to the final report to look at the details of the technology assumptions. My colleague who did the research on that paper isn't on the call, and so I'd let him answer that specifically. But we tried to look at interactive effects with when the units would be running and when that would coincide with peak. So we did our best to capture all of the various impacts that might come in.
Great, thanks. Nicole Kessler asks, when will the final report be available? We're hoping that it'll be available within probably the next 2 to 3 weeks, certainly by the end of the year. And once that is finalized, we'll be posting that on our website. While I'm waiting for any additional questions, Carl, I think in one of your sort of final slides, you mentioned equity and its role, or how that might be considered with regards to electrification. I'm just wondering if, in any of the interviews that you conducted, if equity was raised, and what some of those either concerns or ideas look like.
Yeah, sure. It was definitely a topic that I think a lot of people appreciated. It was the subject of a specific question asked, and then it was a topic that a number of stakeholders brought up, in more detail as well in their responses to other questions. And I'd say I think respondents thought about equity in two different ways. One, from just a stakeholder and an industry perspective, how do we work on a process together where everyone has a voice and a seat at the table, and where people can agree that the outcomes that we've worked through as a community, while maybe not everybody will be totally satisfied with exactly the results, at least they will know that they participated in the process. And to that end, people suggested that transparency, clearly agreed upon goals for processes, and then working through clear metrics were really important components for stakeholder equity in the process. And then on the other side of that topic, a number of people raised equity for, us as the state in terms of, customers and raters. And I think that the equity there comes in two kind of broad categories. One is, who gets to participate in these programs and who gets a rebate, and how much of those, how does that work for customers? And then specifically, is there access, is there access for, say, low-income customers to participate in a program, or do first costs get too high? And then on the second side, there's this question of, how does, assuming that some population of Minnesotans are never going to participate, or might be very slow to participate in an electrification effort, what kind of benefits are realized by them across the grid? Where are the societal benefits, and making sure that those societal benefits are significant enough to merit broad investment in electrification?
Great, thanks, Carl. And for those that aren't as familiar with the Minnesota Conservation Improvement Program, we do currently have a low-income spending requirement as part of the CIP program that the utilities are required to meet each year to try and address some of those equity issues that can come from programs that are directed at a sort of broader market. Carl, we've got another question coming in, this time from Michael Kraus. Availability of enough skilled and craft labor force to implement programs is a critical factor and can drive higher costs to design and build systems, such as EV charging, heat pumps, solar PV, etc. Shouldn't this have been part of the analysis?
Yeah, so I think that's the interesting question that many stakeholders did address as well. And I think that's where a lot of electric utilities feel like they have a unique role to play, because they are great at market transformation through their efficiency programs already, and they're really great at dealing with those systemic barriers to customer adoption of new technologies. And so as you face some of these similar kind of challenges, electric utilities express that they have a toolkit already built and a skilled workforce, internal staff really talented at identifying the right contractors, at training contractors, at promoting the right programs, and offering the right incentives to get customers to adopt new technologies.
Thanks. And just to reiterate how Carl concluded his presentation, this is certainly the beginning of the conversation when it comes to electrification and fuel switching. And I think a number of the issues that those interviewers or interviewees raised, and some of the questions here will be part of the discussion when we start the stakeholder process around fuel switching earlier next year, and then, of course, part of the U.S. Department of Energy funded Electrification Action Plan development as well, and some of this feedback is very helpful in terms of starting to think about how we're going to shape those conversations I don't have any more questions here, but just to reiterate, the next steps that the department will be taking with regards to fuel switching and electrification will be those two processes that I outlined at the beginning of the webinar, and we hope that they will go a long way to facilitate a thoughtful and meaningful conversation around electrification and what that could mean to the Conservation Improvement Program and Minnesota more widely. So please do look out for information around those two initiatives, and we certainly look forward to your participation in the coming months and working towards concluding those initiatives and determining what electrification means for the CIP program. As we conclude here, I just want to thank Carl and Michaels for all of their work on this. I think it's a really excellent white paper, and once that report is finalized, we'll be making sure that is circulated. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mary Sue to conclude the webinar.
Great, thanks. Again, if you have any follow-up questions about either this research or the department's future engagement activities, please feel free to contact Anthony or Carl. I just want to mention that the recording of this webinar and the final report will be available on the Department's Applied Research and Development webpage, which is shown here at some later date, probably in the next few weeks. When available, you can link to them either from the webinar quick link or from the card search quick link, as indicated on this slide. And this R&D page has other additional information that you might want to check out. The address is at the bottom of this slide. Finally, thanks again for participating today. We appreciate your interest in the results from CARD projects. And before I go, I want to take the opportunity to mention two additional CARD webinars that are coming up in December. The first is on December 12th. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy is going to share their findings from the exploration of prepaid electric plans, including potential benefits and drawbacks for utilities and for customers. Then on December 17th, the Center for Energy and Environment will present results of the Minnesota Demand-Side Management Potential Study, which they conducted and was just completed. Announcements about upcoming webinars and other news related to Minnesota's Conservation Improvement Program can be found in the CIP newsletter. I've got a link there for you to sign up for the newsletter if you're interested and are not signed up yet. And if you have any feedback about the upcoming webinars, or if you have questions, feedback, or suggestions for the CARD program, contact me. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day.